All right, I have Morgan Nolte on the podcast talk. One of the topics I really love diving into because it's confusing and people don't know about it and the doctors don't test it. We're going to talk about all things insulin, insulin resistance. So thanks, Morgan, for sharing your knowledge today and coming on my show.
My pleasure. Yeah, it's my favorite topic.
So talk a little bit about how you got to focus on insulin resistance, and we'll talk about what it even is and all things about it.
Yeah, so by trade, I'm a geriatric physical therapist. I'm specialized in geriatrics, and I worked in post-acute rehab and home care were the primary settings. And I saw so many people with end-stage disease. So a lot of people in their 70s, 80s, 90s, they had probably not 90s by this point, if they had end-stage diabetes, obesity, heart disease, dementia, and a lot of falls, a lot of fractures, osteoarthritis. And it was sad and it was hard work and it was emotionally draining. And I realized that a lot of it could be prevented. And I was working, for months with people and we were seeing such minimal gains. And I thought, this feels like it's too little too late. And it feels like there's a lot more that could be done proactively to prevent the need for a geriatric physical therapist in the first place, to prevent the need for 20 different medications in the first place. Like if we could use your time and your energy and your money 20 years ago to help you change your lifestyle, you would have such a higher quality of life now. And so that was important to me, but I also saw their adult children following in their footsteps. Like I would work with the caregivers a lot of the time in these, patient-client relationships, patient-therapist relationships. You got to work the family in geriatrics. And I saw them just eating garbage and not exercising, and they're overweight, they're tired. You could just tell they were not thriving, but there was no one there to help them. Like they're in what I call the gray zone of healthcare. They're not sick enough for their doctor to get too worried. They're not quite at the point where they're on a ton of medications. But if they don't make changes now, so we're talking about really people in midlife, people in their
Yeah.
50s, 55, 60, they're going to have a negative trajectory and it's going to be quick and it's going to really compromise the quality of their life and the quality of their relationships.
Mm.
So that's why I left traditional PT and started my own business that focused on insulin resistance, prevention, and reversal. Because if you're looking at all of the diseases that I was treating in PT, they could all be traced back in some way, shape, or form to high levels of insulin and high levels of inflammation that drove insulin resistance. And so I know it's kind of a weird term. So let's kind of start with well, what is insulin resistance and
Yes.
how do you know if you have it so that I'm gonna tell you this, it's going to be applicable to most people listening, if not like a family member of yours. 88% of adults in America have some degree of insulin resistance. The major symptoms would be things like high blood sugar, absolutely insulin resistant. High blood pressure is often the first symptom of insulin resistance. Weight loss resistance, fatigue, energy swings throughout the day, frequent carb or sugar cravings, skin tags. There's a lot of different diseases that manifest from insulin resistance. Again, some of the big ones would be diabetes, obesity, heart disease, like heart attacks, strokes, those kinds of things. And then Alzheimer's disease is kind of coined type 3 diabetes. We know that central insulin resistance in the brain is one causative factor for Alzheimer's disease. There's a couple others that we can go in or we cannot. Inflammation and oxidative stress would be the other factors there for Alzheimer's. And man, I'm so passionate about it because I have worked with 60-year-olds that act like 80-year-olds. And then from
Yeah.
my own grandparents, they were like 80 and they acted like they were 60 because they took care of themselves. And so personally, I got to be impacted by my grandparents in such a positive way that that's why I went into geriatrics, just to pay it forward, to help other
Mm.
grandparents be healthy so they could be there for their kids, for their grandkids. They could have that impact. They can leave the family values. And it's important. Like grandparents, I feel like grandparents are the CNAs in the hospital. Like the CNAs really run the place. I feel like the grandparents are just that lifeblood of a family, and you can't have that impact if you don't have your freedom and your independence and the cognitive and physical capacity to make that impact. So that's why I'm passionate about it. Back to the insulin resistance, we covered some of the major symptoms. Insulin itself is a hormone made by the pancreas, and its job is to keep your blood sugar levels stable. and what happens over time through various factors, whether it be eating more carbohydrates than what our body can handle, physical inactivity, chronic stress, sleep deprivation. All of those things can actually raise your blood sugar levels, which will then require insulin to push the blood sugar back into your cells to be used for energy or like stored for later use. And over time, if you're repeatedly taxing that pancreas, asking for more and more insulin, your cells are going to start to tune out. They're going to be like, yeah, we've heard this message before. You need some insulin. Like, we're tired of listening to you. It's kind of like, as a parent, you just kind of like tune out the whining from your child after a while. They have to get louder and louder and louder for your attention. That's kind of how insulin works. So more and more and more is needed to keep your blood sugars in a stable range over time. And one of the big sneaky things about insulin resistance is that it takes decades to develop. Like prediabetes and type 2 diabetes, they don't just happen over a year. They don't happen overnight. They have been just ruminating in the background and they haven't been caught proactively because most physicians are not checking fasting insulin. So that's what we should be checking to be proactive about diabetes prevention, because fasting insulin has been shown to predict type 2 diabetes 10 to 20 years before fasting glucose or hemoglobin A1C. Those are downstream effects of your level or degree of insulin resistance in your cells. So that's why I'm so passionate about this. It's like, okay, if we're going to prevent things, we need to be digging deeper than just glucose or A1C.
Yeah, so a lot there. I focus on this podcast to help improve the aging process, and the audience are athletes, endurance athletes. And I've said for years, we've had this podcast 12 years now, that you think you're invincible because you exercise, but that you really think you can do whatever you want. I exercise, I can do a half marathon, a marathon, a triathlon, that I am healthy. But as I became an FDN practitioner, nutritional therapy practitioner, to reveal what's actually going on under the hood, let's do blood chemistry panel with insulin. Let's look at your CRP. Let's look at your full thyroid panel. And let's look at your microbiome and all these other things that you're talking about can show things that we don't know about unless we test. And I find it frustrating. I'm sure you do. It's why you do what you do, probably, that the doctors don't do that, that you have to wait until you're diabetic to get the doctor to test your insulin, where I can go send someone to Ulta Labs or order it through Rupa Health and it's, $15. So what is your thought of why we have to wait until we're diabetic to get tested?
Because that's where the money's at.
Yeah.
Big medicine and big pharma don't make any money if you're healthy, and they're not incentivized to keep you well. And I think that's what you just got to follow the money. And being proactive and preventative does not make anybody money. So it saves you money. Diabetes on average, like for the average person with type 2 diabetes, it's a $4,000 out-of-pocket expense, even with insurance. So being healthy now, investing in high quality food, investing in your physical fitness, investing in your sleep and your stress management, whether that be through counseling, there's zillions of different ways. Man, does that pay off, not only financially, but with your quality of life down the road. So I always get just so frustrated because I don't know, the latest research I saw was like it takes 17 to 24-ish years for the latest evidence to trickle its way down into clinical practice. And I like to say your physician could be dead or retired by then. So you have to be your own self-advocate. And just like you said, understand what values to test, why, what they mean, because I cannot tell you more and more and more when I'm reviewing lab results. I'm seeing the labs completely ignore the pre-diabetic range for blood sugar. So not only are we not testing insulin on a regular basis, now we're overlooking the pre-diabetic level for blood sugar. It actually said normal when someone's blood glucose was in the pre-diabetic range. So we have to recognize that when labs are reporting back, they're reporting back oftentimes averages of,
Yes.
people. And average person is sick. So we don't want to be average. We want to be optimal. But I think it comes down to money, and I think it comes down to a lack of knowledge to prevent and reverse insulin. Just aren't taught that in many of the programs. They're taught we diagnose and then we prescribe a medication. And
on the sound
And
is
I'm always very saddened to hear somebody that there are no solutions besides a medication.
yeah. No, I think my internet is weird, but I think it's frustrating that I got actually example here, a client's doctor to test their insulin, but they were, as you're saying, normal at 7. And in our FDN ranges that are optimal, we say between 1 and 5. What do you find is optimal ranges for insulin?
So I usually say less than 6, but again, I don't use the functional levels like you do. I think functional practitioners have tighter ranges. But I say if it's less than 6, then that's considered in a good range. I go by Dr. Ben Bickman's book,
Yes.
Why We Get Sick, for that
Yeah.
specific recommendation. Yeah.
Yeah, I've been listening to his podcast. If anyone wants, I said this another episode, just said, was talking about the metabolic classroom podcast that he has for insulin IQ
Mhm.
is on podcast apps. If you want to feel like you're back in college and listen to the science of everything, he's amazing to learn from because he is a professor, but he's like the best to explain everything. He's amazing. So let's talk
Yeah.
about, we talked
Great
about
guy.
insulin, but can we talk about signs and symptoms of insulin resistance and then work towards correlating that? Because we look at, put the missing pieces of the puzzle together. But as we say, people don't get it tested. How would they know they might have signs and symptoms of elevated insulin?
Yeah, well, even if you don't get your insulin tested, you can look at just your standard blood panel from your doctor. If your blood glucose is, I would say, over 90, that's not optimal. That's if it's a fasting glucose. Technically over 100, you're going to be in the pre-diabetes range, and that's really when you should start to pay attention, but I think less than 90 is even better. If your hemoglobin A1C is over 5.5, I think that's kind of an area for optimization. If your triglycerides are in the elevated range, if you have excess belly fat, or just weight in general, body in general, or if your blood pressure is high. The other thing that you could look at is if your HDL level is low. So those would be some major clinical markers, but also just pay attention to how you're feeling. If you don't feel like you have great energy, if you feel like you have brain fog, if you're not as sharp and crisp and focused during the day and it's ongoing, if you're frequently thirsty, all of those are kind of some other signs that you might have insulin resistance. And like you said, it's so easy to test. Just get a fasting insulin test. You can go to testing.com to order one. We sell at home finger prick insulin test kits. Even if your doctor's not supportive and they don't want to like write a prescription for it, you can still do it on your own.
Good. Yeah, I think it's really learning to take ownership of your health. And as you're saying, take ownership of your health for your future self. And that's what I keep talking about as you're talking grandparents because you're younger, but I talk about with my parents and how I think so many issues when you're over 80s, they're not really looking at the whole picture. And I lost my dad 2 years ago, really shifted my mindset to like all this can be preventative. But even as we talk to athletes, again, they think they're invincible. And I really believe that we need to test in advance and not wait until you're struggling, wait until you have all these symptoms, to get people to test every 4 to 6 months and really stay on top of it. So we don't wait until we have problems, and being proactive is so essential to quality of life and how we age.
Yeah, do you see a lot of athletes with high HSCRP levels or like chronic low grade systemic inflammation?
Yes, but again, I'm trying to get the people that come to me before you have problems because you all have problems when I see you. So let's not get to this point. Let's know that, okay, I'm in range and retest every 4 months and make sure we're good. But because you're
Mhm.
talking about inflammation, chronic inflammation, and oxidative stress, as you just mentioned it about how that relates to insulin, I think that's a good area to talk a little bit more about because athletes, endurance athletes, and as we age, create more oxidative stress and more harder workouts that you do that you're burning more glycogen is more stress in your body. So talk a little bit that connection you mentioned insulin, inflammation, and CRP, but your oxidative stress levels, if you can have anything on that.
Yes, of course. Yeah, insulin, like high levels of insulin, are caused by a lot of different things. The first thing we always go to is a diet that's not optimized for your goals and your body. I typically recommend a lower carbohydrate, higher protein, healthy fat, fiber approach. That's going to be the dietary approach, at least, for non-athletes. I know you can talk about the nuances there about, how do we keep our insulin low? How do we keep our blood glucose levels stable? I think if you're doing higher intensity sports, like burst activity, timing the carbohydrates with the activity, that's going to be better for your blood sugar management and your insulin regulation long term. But that's just one pillar. Okay. There's two others that I think are really overlooked. The first is stress. And when we think about stress, often we think about emotional stress. However, as you know, this over exercising that athletes can do, that is a stress on your body. That is a cellular stress.
Mhm.
How do we know? Again, we can test metabolically, but if you ever wear a continuous glucose monitor, it's really interesting. If you're doing like a high intensity interval training session or a heavy weight training session, you're going to see your blood sugar go up during a workout. And the reason that is you're using your glycogen and your body's like, oh my gosh, we need more energy. So your liver releases more glucose into your bloodstream. That's where that spike comes in. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. It should come down right away. But over and over and over, if we're just beating our body with these high intensity interval training workouts or these stressful kinds of workouts, and we're not allowing enough time to rest and repair, that's actually not great for your body's physiology. That can contribute to some insulin resistance. But then going back to that psychological stress, man, like Dr. Jason Fung in his book, The Obesity Code, has a great quote. He says, stress contains neither calories nor carbohydrates, but contributes to obesity and insulin resistance. And the reason is because when you're stressed out, your cortisol goes up. And just like when you're doing those high intensity interval trainings, like think about when you were stressed, you wanted to fight like a saber-toothed tiger or another person because they took something of yours. It's fight or flight, it's like we got to use our muscles for both. And so glucose is released into the bloodstream for your muscles to be able to use for energy. But the problem with these psychological stressors is that we're not moving our body. So then what happens? The muscles are not soaking in that energy. Insulin is released to move that blood sugar into the cells to be stored or used later. This must be addressed. Emotional stress, mental stress, because it is contributing to elevated blood sugar and insulin levels over the long run. And then to dovetail off of that is sleep deprivation. I think that there's so much, gosh, in our culture today of like, go, 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 you got to be productive. I know you work with a lot of high achievers. They're probably getting up like at 4 a.m. to get their workout in and not realizing the metabolic damage they're doing through this chronic sleep deprivation and sometimes over exercising. Sleep is when your body restores itself. Sleep is when your body actually rebuilds the muscle. And if you're not getting a good 7 to 8 hours of quality sleep a night, you are absolutely increasing your risk for getting insulin resistance and diabetes for a couple reasons. Number one, it's a stress on your body. I mean, goodness gracious, have a newborn. I got one coming in April, hopefully, and go through that prolonged period of sleep deprivation and tell me that it's not a stress on your body. It is in every single way, shape, and form. You're achy, you're mentally just like not there, you're irritable, you're hungry. And that's kind of the second point is when you're sleep deprived, it changes your food cravings.
Mm.
You want faster energy energy. You want more carbohydrates and sugar. You're not as satiated, so you tend to over. So we really want to dial in good sleep and stress management strategies, not just nutrition and physical activity. We have to take that whole person approach to have sustainable results.
Hmm. Yeah, that's what I talk about. I call it the holistic method, where I work on people's nutrition, their exercise, and their sleep, and their stress, and their movement. It's different than exercise, as well as digestion and gut health, hydration, mineral balancing, and then happiness, gratitude, play, laughter is the eighth element. I think all that's so important because it's working on the whole you from the inside out. But so many people just focus on nutrition and exercising, or just one or the other, and don't really realize how much sleep impacts everything. I was talking to people at the gym this morning. I do wake up early, but that's just my chronotype. I'm an early riser for my whole life. And I prioritize going to bed early. So 8 o'clock, I'm
Mhm.
the early bird that's going to bed. And I go to the gym at 5:15 in the morning, and so many people are still they're there every day, but I talk to them a little more about what time to go to bed, and they're like 10:30. I'm
Oh,
like, okay, you can't I don't offer suggestions or give advice or uh let's say judge anybody, but I just keep my thoughts to myself, like, oh, just wait. Can't keep that up. It's not sustainable.
it's not, and it doesn't feel good. And I think that we ignore our body's signals all too often, about like, I don't know why do you think that is? Do you think it's just our culture of like push through, work hard, don't pay
Hmm.
attention to your emotions? Um, you're fine. It's like
Yeah.
that fine culture, I think is not
Hmm.
not great.
Well, I mean, I wrote my book, Life is Not a Race, It is a Journey, talking about my adrenal exhaustion, air quotes, because whatever it is, metabolic chaos came from doing too much of everything. And it could be because I think I'm invincible and I can just put more in the day, the more successful I am. And redefining that, I think, is what I had to do. It's like just because, you're superhuman that started work at 4:30 in the morning and you work till 8, you think you're just amazing. And oh, I can do this, I can do that. I am healthy. But when I got my health issues 2013, it wasn't just suddenly I had adrenal exhaustion. It was, okay, what happened to those red flags five
Mm,
years beforehand? That's what I think people need to realize. Again, being a health optimizer, know signs and symptoms of having insulin resistance before you are type 2 diabetic, and really looking at educating people on, hey, what does that look like? How should I track that? And these days, it's so much easier than 10 years ago because we can use an Aura or a Whoop and track heart rate variability. But I think a lot of people track, but they don't do anything about that data and they don't use it. So they just think they're cool because they've got an Aura ring because it's trendy, but they don't even know how to interpret the information. And then maybe they do, but maybe they ignore, and it's ignorance is bliss, and it's best not to know. You don't know
yeah.
what you don't know. So then, all right, I'm doing amazing, but even my HRV is tanked today, and I really don't know what that means, but I'm just going to keep pushing through it because I feel really good till I'm
Mhm.
broken.
And HRV is so interesting. I have an 8 sleep, which is a mattress cover. We live in a
Yeah.
100-year-old farmhouse and there's really bad
Mhm.
insulation upstairs. So it
Mhm.
gets so hot in the summer
Mhm.
and really cold in the winter. So that kind of helps with our temperature regulation.
Mhm.
And my heart rate variability tanked like the exact week that I got pregnant because it's a stress on your body to be pregnant. And the other thing happened is my glucose regulation got a lot harder. So in order
Mhm.
to maintain optimal glucose, because I wear a continuous glucose monitor, so I know I can't tolerate the same amount of carbohydrates. And this is called physiological insulin resistance. There are certain times in a woman's life where it intends to be more insulin resistant. And one of them is during pregnancy because it wants more glucose available for the fetus to grow. And so it's
Mhm.
interesting when you understand why is this happening? And how can I adjust my nutrition so that my glucose is in a better range? How can I adjust my physical activity levels? And I think another good example of how hormones really impact weight gain is menopause. Many women experience, I'm not eating any differently. I'm not exercising any
Mm.
differently. And I put on 20 pounds overnight just going through menopause over the last year. And it's like, why did this happen? Well, your
Mhm.
hormones have changed. So just like I'm not eating the volume of calories that would be required to gain 30 pounds in 9 months. But that is what is going to happen as my body becomes more insulin resistant. And when you go through menopause, your body becomes more insulin resistant. And I think it's interesting to understand why. So, estrogen is an insulin sensitizing hormone, which means it helps our insulin work better, meaning we need less insulin to maintain stable blood sugars. But when our estrogen tanks during menopause, we lose that protective effect. So, more insulin is needed. Elevated insulin over a long period of time is going to contribute to insulin resistance. But the other thing that happens is the adrenal glands have to pick up the slack for the estrogen production, and your adipose or your fat tissue starts to pick up the slack for some estrogen production too. So your adrenal glands, if they're already like maxed out producing stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline because you have this fast-paced, high-stress lifestyle, they're not going to have as much capacity to help produce that estrogen. So guess
Mhm.
what? Your fat tissue becomes even more valuable real estate. It's like the boardwalk on Monopoly. We don't want to give that one up. We don't want to mortgage that property. And so it gets harder to lose your fat mass because it's an insulin producing organ after menopause. And we have to change the strategy. It's like whenever your hormones change, your strategy changes. Just like I'm pregnant, my strategy has to change right now with my nutrition and with my exercise. My sleep, thank the good Lord, is still pretty darn good. I know it'll get worse the farther into pregnancy I go. And my stress management, I've had to take stuff off my plate. I've had to change some of my mindset practices to be able to tolerate a little bit more stress, or maybe like keep my stress lower because my physiological stress is naturally higher, right? And stress is stress. Your body doesn't know if it's metabolic stress,
Mhm.
emotional stress, physiological stress, it's stress.
Yeah.
And so because I know innately that physiologic stress is up because of pregnancy, I'm doing more to keep that mental and emotional stress as low as possible. So I wanted to just explain that because I'm guessing a lot of your listeners have had that experience of going through perimenopause or going through menopause, gaining weight, even though they're not eating any differently. Well, like your body has changed, so the strategy must change too.
Yeah, I think that is a big topic of I keep talking men and women, how we need to change how we fuel and train and lifestyle habits each day to improve our body composition and speed up our metabolism and how we need to adjust things a little bit more. So anything in the women, but anything on the men too, because we have half our listeners are male, so we don't want to leave them out because I know they have challenges too.
Yeah, I think some of it too is an identity shift. Like we have some male clients in our program, and I know that it may not be exactly the same for you, but one of our male clients was like a big drinker and like he was the partier, he was the life of the party. And so in order for him to change his lifestyle, he actually had to change his identity. He had to develop different mental skills to be okay not drinking in a social setting. And I'm wondering if there's a lot of your listeners that have had to have an identity shift where maybe they used to be a competitive athlete like yourself, and then what an identity shift it might be to go from being a competitive athlete to just a regular athlete that's like not
Mhm.
competing in Ironman.
Oh
Like,
yeah,
can you
it's
speak
big.
to that a little bit
Yeah.
about the identity shift that your listeners go through that you've heard about?
Yeah, I think it's a super huge area. And I've done some episodes on this years ago. What are you racing for? What are you running from, or what are you running to? So it's more, I know people that are just always running races and just nonstop. And I feel like usually when I talk to people and dive in a little bit deeper, there's other things going on. And they also have previously carb addict, food addictions, alcohol, drugs, sugar.
Mhm.
It's they're usually that addictive personality and they find exercise as a solution for that addictive behavior. But then there's people that get that identity, as I did, doing Ironmans every day. Every day, someone would ask me, when's your next race? And then when I couldn't race anymore because of my health issues and I'm more retired athlete, that people stopped doing that. And then it was like, when's your next vacation? Where are you going? And you had to shift because I know a client that's struggling with that now. She's always done adventure races and she knows she needs to dial it down and not do these 5-day nonstop races because it's destroying her health and her body. And really, it's trying to figure out, I think, doing kind of our behavior motivational interviewing techniques of diving in a little deeper into coaching sessions. Like, okay, what else do you enjoy doing? What makes you happy? And really changing things up. I moved from Seattle to San Diego, so that really helped me change in my lifestyle. And but not everyone can just get up and move. And so I think there's a lot to it. But yeah, people get that identity and know how to, I need to change my ways if I want to get healthy. I need to really look at how do I want to be showing up to life when I'm 80 years old, is what I always say. Like, what does your future self look like? Are you helping it with what you're doing today? Do you want to be traveling Europe as I do, going away for 3 months, being able to climb the stairs and walk on the cobblestones and all that without a walker or having to do it from a bus tour? So I think about that.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I just think that there's such a mental and emotional aspect to behavior change because that's what it comes down to. Like,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, you can do a keto diet for 2 weeks and you're going to see improvements in your glucose level. But I always say it's not about like the weight that you lose. It's about losing weight and keeping it off. Or if you don't have weight to lose, it's about improving your health and sustaining those results. And so when we're talking about a more holistic approach that's sustainable, a lot of times that does require an identity shift. Every single time it requires habit change and thought change. And so I think that I'm equally as passionate about that side as I am giving you the right strategy. Because I know I could sit on this podcast and walk you through a nutritional program and exercise program and all that stuff and give you sleep tips, but it's going to go in one ear and out the other if we don't address behavior change and thought change and really get to the root cause of why do you behave the way that you do?
Yeah.
What do you want your future self to look like? And where are the discrepancies between those two versions of yourself? And how can we start filling that gap?
Yeah, I just did 6 month training, prepare for that National Health and Wellness Board certification. And really you end up, it's behavior coaching is motivational interviewing, open-ended questions, and diving in deeper to figure out what is your why and digging into it. Because everyone knows by now the lower carb, strategic carb time for exercise and sleep and starts to hear about that. They're all listening to podcasts, they listen to Huberman. But if it was so easy just doing we would all be golden, right? And have these great results. But it's more like, okay, how do I switch that behavior is the hardest thing. And how do I not have candy and processed foods and junk from the kids eating off their plate and going out to dinner and just thinking I'm going to eat whatever I want because I worked out. I think it's really looking at the why behind everything is what I do.
Yeah, there's a sign behind me that says, keep your eye on your why. You can't read it, but that's what it says. And for me, it's just, remembering the impact that my grandparents had on my life and understanding that that's how I want to pay it forward. But also that's what I want to do. Like, I don't want my kids to worry about when I'm carrying their babies up and down stairs. I
Mhm.
want, I want to be able to, like, God willing, live long enough and have the health to be active and travel with my husband and um, just be a present grandma and an active
Mhm.
grandma. It's just like, I think as a mom, you just have a different view on grandmas and you realize how valuable they are for your marriage and for the upbringing of your children. And I have a healthy mom and I have a healthy mother-in-law. And if I didn't have that support system, my life would be a lot harder. And so I'm very grateful to have them in my life. And thinking through how do we start to make these changes? Because there are many people that are just, man, they're just not killing it. Like they're not killing it with their
Mhm.
nutrition, their exercise, their stress, their sleep. And I always like to say, number one, we have to start the practice of gratitude and of
Mhm.
wins. every single day, especially on the hard days. Like my husband's a farmer and harvest is always a difficult season for me. And what I have realized this season is the more I lean into my gains, the better my mental health is, the better my emotional health is, the better my focus is at work on my nutrition and my ability to follow through on my exercise program. Because there are so many people who are mentally and emotionally drained from relational stress or from work stress that they just can't even like go to the gym. They just can't
Mhm.
even have the energy to cook a healthy meal. So I think until we really start to value our mental and our emotional health as much as our physical health, we're always going to feel like we're striving for something that's out of our reach. So for me personally, I really like to coach people on recognize your gratitude and at least 3 gains a day.
Mhm.
And a gain is something that you're proud that you either did or you didn't do. And for me, again, in this season, I have to be specific. So my journal, it's like, I made a loaf of sourdough bread this morning. I reviewed some video scripts. I put my laundry away instead of letting it sit out for weeks and weeks. Did the dishes. I made my bed, put the kids' laundry away. But then something that really helps me from a relational standpoint, I've just discovered this, is counting my husband's wins too, especially in this season when he's gone. So if a lot of your mental and emotional stress comes from a relationship, instead of focusing on what you wish that person was doing for you or how you wish they were showing up differently for you, one little tip I found helpful is to count his wins. So he got the kids up and got them showered. He packed their lunches and, packed their backpacks. He agreed to watch them tomorrow so I could go to a school board meeting. He's working hard for our family. And I kid you not, like where you focus, that will grow. So when you focus on the gains, you will get more gains in a day. When
Yeah.
you focus on somebody else's gains, you will have a more positive relationship. So I think those tiny little mental and emotional shifts of looking for your gains. I think the book, The Gap and the Gain, is a really quick,
Mhm.
easy read. Have you read that one yet?
No, I haven't. I'm writing that down.
It's a good one. Yeah, it's a good one. And it's something that it's like a concept that I knew about for a long time and I was loosely practicing it, but during this hard season, I am intentional to actively practice it and it makes a huge difference with my mood and my health. Um,
Yes.
and then Atomic Habits, have you heard of that one, I'm guessing?
Yes, for
Yeah,
sure.
that's another great book for somebody who's interested in changing their habits to think
Mhm.
about how can I make whatever habit I want to do easier, more obvious, more enjoyable, etc. So I would recommend those 2 books from like a mindset behavior change
Mhm.
standpoint if people are interested in learning more about these topics.
Yeah, so you're talking about insulin resistance and how to fix it, but people probably wonder, like, oh, why are we talking about gratitude and how is amazing today to fix it?
Yeah.
But you're kind of connecting the dots together that a lot of our reasons for being insulin resistant or having elevated insulin is possibly coming from our way of life and living life as a race, having chronically high stress levels, how maybe elevated cortisol, HPA axis dysfunction that can lead to insulin resistance, not just eating a bunch of carbohydrates all day and overloading your body that way through raising glucose, but glucose being raised from cortisol because of chronic stress.
Well, yeah, and stress is a double-edged sword for many people because it drives emotional eating. So
Yeah.
not only do you get the glucose spike from the cortisol, but then you're probably like, so stress, cortisol, it actually raises the substance in your body called NPY. And NPY makes you
Mhm.
preferentially crave carbohydrates. So you're going to want to turn to the Ben and Jerry's ice cream after a hard day or a hard conversation with your spouse. You're going to have that I deserve it feeling after a hard momming day. And
Yeah.
so if you don't understand your personal food triggers, or what are your cues that drive your eating? Like another example, an empty plate. Like that is one for me. Just simply having an empty plate of food after the meal is a cue to make me want to go get more food.
Mhm.
And so we have to get really good at studying ourselves as much as we study, if not more, books, podcasts, YouTube videos, those are great and they are great resources and they are great tools. But the best teacher is your experience. So if you can pause throughout the day, pause during a meal, pause before a meal and pause after a meal and say, why did I choose to eat right now?
Mhm.
Was I actually hungry?
Yeah.
Why did I choose to eat the food that I did? Was that intentional or was it habitual? What would a better choice have been? There's so many really, really good questions that we can ask ourselves to kind of be a detective of our own behavior. And that's
Mhm.
why I talk so much about the mental emotional side of it is if you don't really master your emotions and master your thoughts, you will never master your physical health. It will always
Mhm.
be elusive because
Sure.
your thoughts really create your emotions drive your actions, and ultimately your actions drive your results. But it starts with our thinking.
Yeah, that's true. Ben Azadi always talks about that. And I find that true. And that's why, I didn't really get myself healthy until I moved
Mm.
in 2020 because I kept stopped racing, but then I started doing something else. And then I started working more. And then I had closed my fitness studio that I thought, oh, okay, my stress is gone because I got rid of owning a fitness studio, brick and mortar. And then I replaced that by going to different places to train clients and run and then coach people. And it was just chaotic again. And then I was always grateful for COVID. It's like, oh, all right, we have this new way of living called Zoom, work remote, but how I can just be outside and move more in the outdoors. So I think it's everyone's so different and it's not one size fits all approach. We have to look at, yes, let's test your insulin first, right? And you're
Yeah.
saying,
Wait.
how often should we test?
I'd say at least once a year, especially if you're concerned about your metabolic health.
Yeah.
I the nice thing to test because it's going to be more sensitive than glucose or A1C. So, or weight, so you might not see a bunch of changes in the other number, but start to see that insulin drop in the background, just like it was rising in the background
Mm.
before.
Yeah. So first step is get tested and
Mhm.
then work with the coach. I think ideally a practitioner to help you understand why is my insulin high? And then investigate all the different sources that could be causing that to be high because it might be as myself, I was low carb doing keto-ish at the time, then it's more what else is driving that up and then work on those areas. But I totally agree with you is like I can't just work on changing someone's nutrition unless we work on the why and the mental connection. But what are some other reasons that we talk about the high insulin? It could be related to other dysfunctions within the body besides the chronic stress. Have you got
There
into
are
any other
some
sources?
like hypothyroid is one example. The thyroid hormones really impact metabolism. And
Mhm.
so insulin resistance and hypothyroid kind of go hand in hand. If you have high levels of insulin, that can impact how T4, which is the inactive version of thyroid, is converted into T3. So
Mhm.
high levels of insulin or insulin resistance can be a causative factor of low thyroid or like hypothyroid disease. But by the same token, hypothyroid disease itself impacts glucose metabolism, contributes to higher blood glucose levels, which will ultimately contribute to more insulin resistance. So that is definitely one of them. Another thing would be medications. So unfortunately, like we were talking about earlier, physicians are taught to diagnose and prescribe. Well, some of those medications that they're prescribing, a lot of statins, some blood pressure lowering medications, some medications for depression, some for anxiety, corticosteroids, all of those will raise that baseline level of insulin resistance. And so that creates like a floor effect for how well you can get. It's like, well, you're
Mhm.
only going to get so well while you're taking these medications. I'm a huge, huge advocate for trying to prevent the need for medications or get off of medication safely, working with your physician for that reason. So those are a couple of the things that I would throw in there would be thyroid function, and then medications that you're on can also contribute to some insulin issues.
Then it's also PCOS. I've heard
Mhm.
a lot of correlation with PCOS and insulin resistance for younger females often.
Yeah, I think insulin resistance really plays a more causative factor in PCOS, whereas again, the physician's treating more the symptoms. They might say, "Oh, well, you have PCOS and you need to take these hormones," instead of saying, "Well, why do you have PCOS?" And so insulin resistance and living this low insulin lifestyle that we've been talking about can really help women reverse PCOS. Of course, I'm of childbearing age still, and I'm very surprised at how many cases of infertility we know about. Like in our last neighborhood, there were three families that we were close to, and all three of them had to go through IVF. And we have another close family friend doing IVF right now. And a big part of this, I think, is metabolic dysfunction and women who have, goodness, used birth control for decades, and then they get off, and then all of a sudden they expect that their body's just going to work normally again. So it's sad. You're kind of talking about like the people at the gym who, they go to bed at 10:30 and they're getting up at 5 and you're just like, oh no, oh no, oh no, but I don't want to give them unsolicited advice. That's how I feel when I'm around a lot of my friends who struggle with infertility.
Mhm.
Because like, man, you could change some things about your lifestyle and your diet and have a higher chance of conceiving. And it's like, it's sad. Like that is one of the most stressful things a couple can go through, right? And
Mhm.
so I think that just for the future generations, having good metabolic health as parents is important. Um, it's a good example to set for our kids too. So it's a
Well,
whole nother thing.
I think that's so important. And what is metabolic health and how it's measured? I did a whole article, rabbit hole, and I don't know if I did a video on it yet, but just how the markers don't include a lot of things we should be looking at because metabolic health, they're looking at the waist circumference, your
Yeah.
glucose, your cholesterol, which doesn't tell you a lot either. And what was the other things? There's five markers, and if you have three of them, you are metabolically unhealthy.
Yeah, blood pressure, HDL,
Oh, blood
glucose,
pressure.
waist
Yes.
circumference, triglycerides
Yeah.
for metabolic syndrome. Yeah.
So I think of that as I wrote an article and I was doing
Yeah.
research. Like, well, shouldn't we just look at not cholesterol, but look at the other newer markers as LP little a, the type of particle size, or APOB, and looking at that. And then instead of glucose, let's look at insulin and triglycerides I get. But the other markers, like, well, yeah, I don't know if that really gives people true sense of are you metabolically healthy or not and have dysfunction. But
Yep.
again, it's thinking we're fit and healthy on the outside, but not on the inside. And I think
And
for
it's
our podcast listeners, don't really, you're not all healthy just because you can do an Ironman.
Yeah, no, growing up, there was this guy, my best friend and I would run on the treadmill after school. And there was this guy that would run next to us for like 2 hours and he would get so sweaty, he would have to change his shirt. And he was like at a clipping pace too. He was way faster than us. And he died of like a heart attack. And he was
Wow.
probably in his 40s. And you mentioned LP little a. Like Bob Harper, the trainer from The Biggest Loser, had a heart attack, probably had high LP little a. That's a genetic risk
Mm-hmm.
factor for cardiovascular disease.
Mm-hmm.
And there are things that you can't do anything about it, but there's other lifestyle changes that you can make to mitigate that risk. And so I just think it's very important for the people that you're talking to. I was just had someone else on my podcast, Holly Bertone. She was 110 pounds. Well, she's has a really interesting story. Um, she lost a bunch of weight, got to 110 pounds, was doing professional mountain bike racing, but her diet was like crap. She was eating like some of her lunch. She'd have six Cokes a day. She would have like
Oh.
a bag of peanut M&Ms for lunch, and she thought she was healthy because she was active, active, active. She had a six pack, but then she was diagnosed with breast cancer. And
Mm-hmm.
then she was diagnosed with Hashimoto's disease. And so she really had to, like yourself, get to the root cause of all of these things and realize that, wow, just because I'm super active and have a good physique doesn't mean that my nutrition doesn't need to be dialed in, doesn't mean that my overachiever lifestyle like doesn't need to be dialed in. It does. And so there's definitely so many stories like that, like yourself out there. And I think that it's a really important message that you have to share with your audience of like, hey, external, you can't judge a book by its cover. You can't judge your body by its appearance and by your ability to do an Ironman. We want to look a little bit deeper. So you have a great
Mhm.
message.
Thank you. So talk about where we could learn more about you, and you have your podcast as well. Share away.
Yeah, so my podcast is Reshape Your Health with Dr. Morgan Nolte. It's a nice combination of expert interviews. I do mindset tip episodes. YouTube, I'm like a lot of YouTube channel stuff, like a lot of tips on blood sugar management. Just Google Dr. Morgan Nolte and it'll come up. And then our website is zivli.com, zivli.com. Weird name. So Ziv means to live in Croatian. And then the Li means a low insulin and low inflammation lifestyle.
Oh,
So
look at that.
that's what it means. Yeah. Zivli.com is where they can check out our program, podcast, all the things.
Amazing. Well, thank you for doing what you do, because I think, I love when people have specific niches. As I know a gal I was talking to does just mold illness and insulin resistance, and everything's all connected, but it's really looking at, okay, this is a big sign if your insulin is above where you want, and then look at why is it? What are the sources of chronic stress? If it's mold or if it's nutrition or it's our mindset, it's just shows that it could be from anywhere. And that's why we need to have practitioner coaches work together to help reveal that, because the doctors are just going to give you medication or not
Unfortunately,
even test it. We might not even get there. You might just get some metformin, but not know why. Why? That drives
or
me
how to get
nuts.
off of it. So many people
Yeah.
are prescribed medications and they're assumed to be on them for the rest of their life. And you don't, that doesn't necessarily have to be the case with a lot of medications for a lot of people. So
Mm-hmm.
there is hope.
Yeah.
All
All
right.
right.
Well,
Well,
thank
thanks
you.
so much, Morgan.
My pleasure.